My father stood up in front of 23 relatives, pointed directly at me, and shouted, "You're uneducated trash." A complete embarrassment to this family. The room went silent. My older brother smirked while everyone stared. Then my father grabbed my bag, threw it at the door, and screamed, "Get out of my house." I picked up my bag without saying a word, because arguing would change nothing. What none of them knew was that I had spent the last 7 years building something in secret. And less than 24 hours later, a single phone call would expose a truth so shocking that the same people who threw me out would be begging for a second chance. My name is Emma Carter, and I was 32 years old when my father stood up in front of our entire family and called me uneducated trash. If someone had told me that night would completely change my life, I would have laughed. Not because I didn't believe change was possible, because I had spent most of my life getting used to disappointment. It happened during my father's 63rd birthday dinner. The whole family was there. My mother, my older brother, Daniel, his wife, several cousins, 2 uncles, an aunt. The dining room was packed with laughter, conversation, and the familiar feeling that I didn't belong. I sat quietly near the end of the table while everyone listened to Daniel talk about his latest promotion. Daniel had always been the family success story. He graduated from a prestigious university, earned an MBA, worked for a major investment firm, bought a large house before turning 35. Everything he did became family legend. Every achievement was repeated so many times that I practically knew the stories by heart. Meanwhile, I never went to college. At least, not in the traditional way. Whenever relatives asked what I did for a living, I usually gave vague answers. It was easier than explaining, and much easier than dealing with the judgment that always followed. As expected, the conversation eventually shifted toward me. My uncle chuckled. "Emma's still figuring out what she wants to do with her life?" A few people laughed. I forced a smile. Before I could answer, Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Some people just aren't built for academics." More laughter. My father nodded in agreement. That's putting it politely. The room grew uncomfortable. At least for me. Not for them. This wasn't new. For years, I had listened to variations of the same speech. Daniel was ambitious. Daniel was successful. Daniel made the family proud. And Emma? Emma was the disappointment. The child who never lived up to expectations. The one who supposedly wasted her potential. I kept my eyes on my plate and said nothing. Arguing never changed anything. A few minutes later, my cousin mentioned hearing that I had recently turned down a corporate job offer. That got my father's attention immediately. "You turned down a real job?" he asked. I calmly nodded. It wasn't the right fit. The expression on his face darkened instantly. "Not the right fit?" His voice became louder. "Do you have any idea how ridiculous that sounds?" The room fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward us. I could feel the familiar tension building. My mother stared at her hands. Daniel looked amused. I already knew where this was going. My father stood up from his chair. "Your brother worked for everything he has." His finger pointed directly at me. "And you keep wasting opportunity after opportunity." "Dad." "No." His voice thundered across the room. "For years I've watched you drift through life." I swallowed hard. The room felt smaller by the second. "You had every advantage." His face turned red with anger. "And what do you have to show for it?" Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. Nobody defended me. Then came the words I would never forget. "You are uneducated trash." The silence that followed felt endless. My heart pounded in my chest. My father wasn't finished. He pointed toward the front door. "Get out." I stared at him. For a moment, I honestly thought I had heard him wrong. "Excuse me? Get out of my house." His voice grew even louder. "You lowlife." My mother finally looked up, but she said nothing. Not one word. Daniel sat there with a small smirk on his face, almost like he was enjoying the show. Something inside me broke. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Quietly. Like a rope finally snapping after years of strain. I stood up, picked up my bag, looked around the room one final time. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked me to stay. So I walked out. The cold evening air hit my face as I reached my car. For several seconds, I simply sat behind the wheel, trying to process what had just happened. Then my phone rang. I almost ignored it, but the caller ID made me pause. It was someone I had been waiting to hear from for months. I answered. "Hello." The voice on the other end sounded excited. "Emma, it's official." I sat up straight. "What is?" "The acquisition just closed." My heart stopped. The caller laughed. "Congratulations." I gripped the steering wheel. The next words changed everything. "Your ownership stake is now worth just over $20 million. I closed my eyes. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. Inside my father's house, everyone still believed I was a failure. They believed I had nothing. They believed they knew exactly who I was. I slowly looked back at the house through the windshield. Then I whispered 4 quiet words. "Tomorrow changes everything." I barely slept that night. Not because of the money, not because of the acquisition, and not because my ownership stake had suddenly become worth more than $20 million. I couldn't stop replaying the dinner in my head. My father's voice, my brother's smirk, my mother's silence. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to finally prove them wrong. Now that moment had arrived. And somehow, it didn't feel the way I expected. As the sun rose the next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and thought about how it had all started. 7 years earlier, I was 25 years old and completely lost. At least that's what my family believed. The truth was more complicated. I had never been a strong student. Numbers interested me. Business fascinated me. But classrooms never did. While Daniel collected degrees and awards, I spent my free time teaching myself skills online. Marketing, software systems, digital operations, business strategy. Most people didn't take it seriously, especially my family. Every holiday gathering turned into another lecture, another comparison, another reminder that Daniel was succeeding while I was supposedly falling behind. At first, their opinions hurt. Then they motivated me. Eventually, they became background noise. I worked several small jobs during those years. Customer support, freelance consulting, data entry projects, anything that paid the bills. While everyone assumed I was drifting through life, I was quietly saving every dollar I could. Eventually, I partnered with 2 software developers I met through an online business community. Together, we started building a logistics platform. The goal was simple: help small companies manage deliveries more efficiently. Nothing glamorous, nothing exciting, just a practical solution to a real problem. The first year was brutal. We made almost no money. The second year wasn't much better. Several clients left. A major contract collapsed. There were moments when I wondered if my family had been right all along. But every setback taught us something. Every failure improved the product. Slowly, things started changing. A few customers became dozens. Dozens became hundreds. Our software expanded into multiple states. Revenue increased. Investors started calling. For the first time, success felt possible. The funny thing was that I never told my family. At first, it was because I didn't want to jinx it. Later, it became something else. I realized they had already decided who I was. Nothing I said would change their minds. So, I stopped trying. While they continued treating me like a disappointment, I focused on building the company. Year after year. Quietly. Patiently. One contract at a time. By the 6th year, our growth accelerated dramatically. Several major corporations adopted our platform. Industry publications began mentioning our company. Competitors approached us with partnership offers. Then came the acquisition discussions. A large technology group wanted to purchase the business. The negotiations lasted nearly 8 months. Lawyers, accountants, endless meetings, stacks of paperwork. Throughout the entire process, my family remained completely unaware. The night my father threw me out happened to be the exact night the acquisition officially closed. The timing almost felt unreal. 24 hours earlier, I had been sitting at a dinner table being called a failure. Now financial websites across the country were publishing headlines about the acquisition. Around 9 that morning, my phone started ringing. I ignored most of the calls. Many came from investors. Some came from reporters. Then another call appeared. My cousin Rachel. I answered. Hello. Her voice sounded breathless. Emma, is this true? I already knew what she was referring to. What part? The news article. I looked at the headline on my laptop screen. The founder's photograph sat directly beside it. There was no denying it anymore. Yes, I said calmly. A long silence followed. Oh my God. Within an hour, the entire family knew. Relatives who hadn't called me in years suddenly remembered my phone number. Text messages flooded in. Congratulations. We're so proud of you. Always knew you'd succeed. Some messages were almost funny. People who had ignored me for years suddenly wanted a relationship. Then my phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. I answered. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he cleared his throat. Is the article accurate? Yes. Another silence. You built that company? I did. He sounded stunned, almost confused, as if reality itself had betrayed him. But how? I smiled slightly. The same question nobody had bothered asking for 7 years. Later that afternoon, another headline appeared. The acquisition story was spreading rapidly. Business publications wanted interviews. Industry podcasts requested appearances. And then something happened that nobody expected. An invitation arrived from one of the largest technology conferences in the region. They wanted me to be the featured keynote speaker. The event was scheduled for the following week. Thousands of attendees would be watching. I accepted immediately. A few hours later, my father received the same announcement. And for the first time in my life, he was about to sit in a room where everyone knew my name. My father stared at the conference invitation in disbelief. The daughter he had called uneducated trash less than 24 hours earlier was about to take center stage in front of an audience that respected her more than he ever had. The technology conference took place 6 days later. More than 3,000 people attended every year. Founders, investors, executives, industry leaders, people from companies I had admired for years. The event was being held in one of the largest convention centers in Chicago. I arrived early that morning. For the first time since the acquisition announcement, I felt nervous. Not because of the audience, because I knew my family would be there. The conference organizers had publicly announced my keynote appearance. The story of the acquisition had become one of the biggest business stories of the month. Everyone wanted to hear how an unknown founder had quietly built a company worth millions. Backstage, I reviewed my notes while event staff prepared the main hall. A few minutes before the presentation began, I glanced toward the audience. And there they were. My father, my mother, Daniel, several relatives, sitting together near the front. My father looked uncomfortable, almost lost. For years he had believed success looked only one way. Now he was surrounded by thousands of people who disagreed. The lights dimmed. The room became silent. Then my introduction appeared on the giant screens. A short video played. Photos from the company's early days flashed across the screens. Images of our first tiny office. Our first software prototype. Our first team. The audience applauded as I walked onto the stage. The sound was overwhelming. For a moment, I simply stood there, looking out at thousands of faces. Then I began. 7 years ago, I started my company from a small apartment with 2 laptops and a dream. The room became completely silent. I spoke about failure, about uncertainty, about learning skills when nobody believed in me, about making mistakes and starting over, about persistence. I never mentioned my father. I never mentioned the dinner. I never mentioned being called uneducated trash. There was no need. This wasn't about revenge. This was about truth. The audience listened carefully as I described the difficult years. The months when we almost ran out of money. The contracts we lost. The setbacks that nearly ended everything. Then I shared the lesson that had carried me through every challenge. Sometimes people judge your future based on your present circumstances. The room remained silent. You cannot allow other people's opinions to become your limitations. Several people nodded. Others began taking notes. I continued. The people around you may not understand your vision. That's okay. A few audience members smiled. They don't need to believe in you first. The applause started before I even finished the sentence. By the end of the presentation, the entire audience was on its feet. Thousands of people applauding. The standing ovation lasted nearly a minute. I thanked everyone and stepped away from the microphone. As I walked backstage, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Peace. The need to prove myself had finally disappeared. A few minutes later, attendees filled the lobby area outside the auditorium. I was speaking with several investors when I noticed my family approaching. My father walked slowly. The confident man who had shouted at me 6 days earlier seemed completely different now. When he stopped in front of me, he looked down briefly before speaking. I'm sorry. The words came out quietly, almost painfully. Nobody spoke. The surrounding noise seemed to disappear. My father looked directly at me. I was wrong. His voice shook slightly. I spent years judging you by things that never truly mattered. I said nothing. He continued. I thought success was degrees, titles, and status. His eyes became watery, and I was too stubborn to see your character. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine regret in his face. Not embarrassment, not pride, regret. My mother stepped forward next. I'm sorry too. Tears filled her eyes. I should have defended you. I nodded slowly. Then Daniel cleared his throat. The former golden child suddenly looked very ordinary. I owe you an apology. He forced a small smile. I spent years acting like I was better than you. For a moment, nobody moved. Finally, I spoke. I appreciate the apologies. Relief appeared across their faces. But I wasn't finished. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. The smiles faded. It takes time to rebuild trust. They nodded, because deep down, they knew it was true. My father looked at me again. Can we start over? I thought about the dinner, the insults, the years of judgment. Then I thought about everything I had learned. Holding on to anger wouldn't change the past, but healthy boundaries would protect my future. We can try, I said. Months later, our relationship slowly improved. Not perfectly, not instantly, but honestly. And that made all the difference. The night my father called me uneducated trash, he thought he was defining my future. In reality, he was revealing his own limitations. Less than 24 hours later, the world saw my success. But the real victory wasn't the money. It was finally understanding that my worth had never depended on anyone else's opinion. And from that day forward, I never forgot it.